The creator of the survival horror genre, the first Resident Evil game released in 1996 for the PlayStation. It also received numerous ports to other platforms afterwards, including PC, Sega Saturn, and even the Nintendo DS. Now, with the recent release on GOG.com, there are many different ways to play this game on PC, including all the emulated versions. So you might be wondering which is the best way to play it on PC? Well, in this video we're going to compare all of them and try to find out. Let's begin by looking at the original version of the game, which is the PlayStation version. We're going to emulate it using the Duckstation emulator. Now, you might be aware of the fact that there are actually 3 different versions of this game on PlayStation, but I'll talk more about the differences between those later. For now, let's focus on how the game runs and looks on Duckstation. Well, to put it simply, it seems to run flawlessly, with no audio or visual glitches. It's limited to 30 FPS during gameplay, and the FMV cutscenes play at 15 FPS at a native resolution of 320 by 240. And the great thing about Duckstation is that it offers many ways to set up the visual presentation of the game. You can play it at high internal resolutions like 4K, or you can go for a retro look by playing at native resolution. You can also combine the 2 options and run it internally at 4K, but downsampling it to the native resolution, which creates a different look. You can even use CRT filters to make the retro look more authentic. And if you're playing in high resolution, you can use PGXP to remove the wobbling that happens in PS1 games due to the low precision rendering. The only thing that Duckstation can't do is increase the resolution of the pre-rendered background textures, at least not without using a texture pack. And I haven't found any packs that I would consider good looking. So I recommend always using nearest neighbor texture filtering when playing these games on Duckstation. So, Duckstation offers a great emulation experience, but what about the differences between the versions? There were 3 different releases on PlayStation. The original one called Resident Evil, which launched in 1996. The second version called Resident Evil Director's Cut, which launched in 1997 and included an extra mode called Arrange Mode, which featured different enemy and item placements and different weapons and unlockable costumes. And the third version, which is called Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version, and launched in 1998. This one is the same as the previous one, but added support for the DualShock controller and featured a new soundtrack that is widely considered to be worse than the original, and it's part of a crazy story involving its composer. Basically, Mamoru Samuragochi, the official composer, who was known at the time as the Deaf Genius Composer, admitted in 2014 that he wasn't actually deaf and that most of the compositions attributed to him were actually created by a different composer named Takashi Niigaki. And one of these was the soundtrack made for the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version. Now, regardless of who composed it, I'd say it's pretty clear that the original's better. Listen to this basement song from the original soundtrack. Now here's the DualShock version. Yeah, pretty rough, right? So obviously this version is not recommended at all. Aside from that, both the regular Director's Cut and the DualShock version were supposed to feature uncensored cutscenes compared to the original, but due to an error by Capcom's localization team, these versions ended up having the same censored cutscenes from the original version. That's where unofficial versions come into play. Basically, there are many fan ROM hacks for the Resident Evil games, and using one of these is the only way to play Resident Evil in English with uncensored cutscenes on Duckstation. I recommend using the True Director's Cut, which is a ROM hack that only includes uncensored cutscenes and some cut content from beta versions of the game. Other ROM hacks generally feature fan content, which doesn't really have the same assurance of quality as the official Capcom content. Now here are some final things worth noting about playing this game on Duckstation. When you move between different camera angles, there's a short pause because the emulator is, well, emulating the way that a real PS1 would have to read data from a disc. There are ways to speed this up using different settings, which I'll talk about shortly. And another thing is that none of the PS1 versions of the game allows the player to skip the door opening animations, but some of the other versions do allow it. Anyway, here are the settings I've used for playing in high resolution. Make sure to force the game to 4:3 aspect ratio, otherwise the game will display in the wrong aspect ratio. As for the pausing between camera angles, the relevant settings are the CD-ROM emulation settings in the console section. I've tested many combinations and these were the best I could get. Setting read speed up to anything higher than 6 times would cause the emulator to freeze during booting, and I don't think that preloading the image to RAM makes any difference. Anyway, these settings on screen make the game much more fluid and I didn't have any problems with them. Okay, now let's move on to the second option, which is the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil. The Sega Saturn is a notoriously difficult console to emulate due to its complex architecture with multiple CPUs and GPUs. For that reason, I had to run the game on 2 emulators. The first one I tried was Yaba Sanshiro 2, and I chose it because it's one of the few Saturn emulators that offers the option to increase the internal resolution. So, as you can see in the footage, it does run Resident Evil and you can play it at high resolutions. However, I ran into a game breaking problem with this emulator. Basically, after a few minutes of playing the game, the audio cuts off and that makes the game hard-locked during certain cutscenes or timed events. It doesn't seem to be related to the resolution increase either, as it happened even when running the game normally at native resolution. So, since it seems that this emulator has a compatibility problem with Resident Evil, I tried another emulator which is called Mednafen. From what I can tell, the game runs perfectly on Mednafen. However, the emulator does not offer any visual enhancements, unlike Yaba Sanshiro 2. Still, running the game at high resolutions but without something like PGXP to correct the low precision wobbling isn't exactly ideal, so you're not missing much. Now let's talk more about the differences between this and the original PlayStation version. Aside from the pre-rendered background textures, most of the game's presentation looks quite different. The colors and textures on the characters are the most noticeable differences right off the bat. Then there's the blood puddles, which are very different, and I kinda prefer the Saturn version to be honest. And of course, most of the transparent effects on PlayStation are replaced with dithered effects on Saturn, which happened on many games due to Saturn's difficulty in rendering alpha transparency effects. In addition to the visuals, the sound is also different. Some sound effects sound completely different, and all of the sound in general is inferior in quality compared to the PlayStation. Now there's one thing that this version has that's not available anywhere else, and that is the battle mode, which is an extra game mode where you go through different areas killing every enemy in the shortest time possible. Kind of an early precursor to the mercenaries mode introduced in Resident Evil 3. It's a cool little addition, but not enough I'd say to make this version, which is inferior in visuals and audio, worth recommending. Now let's talk about the PC versions. There are basically 2 options. The old PC version from 1996 and the recent one from GOG.com. Starting with the 96 version, the game actually still works on Windows 10 and 11, but not without issues. The American edition of the game has several bugs, including visual artifacts, the game running faster than normal, and the game-breaking issue where the game hardlocks when playing this cutscene during the Jill playthrough. The only way to fix those problems is to use the Japanese edition with the classic Rebirth mod. With it, the game runs perfectly, without visual bugs, at the right speed and frame rate, which is 30 FPS most of the time, and with more graphical options to choose from. Now, there's another thing you can do to this version of the game that is pretty interesting. You may have heard of the Seamless HD project. It's basically a mod that replaces most of the textures with AI upscaled ones, or in some cases, fully remade textures. And it does so while fixing most seam issues that can happen with masked background textures. It looks very good, especially if you're playing in high resolutions. It seems though that the upscaled textures are intended for 1080p at most, and at 4K some aliasing is noticeable. Still, it's a pretty interesting mod that I would recommend giving a try. Then there's the GOG version, which is basically the 96 version with some fixes pre-applied. It's perfectly playable out of the box and is very similar to the 96 version using the classic Rebirth mod. The main differences between those are the rendering resolution of the 3D characters, which is lower on GOG, and the FMV cutscenes, which are much lower quality on GOG than the ones in the high-quality movie pack from the classic Rebirth mod. These FMV cutscenes play at 10 FPS on GOG, compared to the 15 FPS of the classic Rebirth and PlayStation and Saturn versions. The seamless HD cutscenes are the only ones that play at 30 FPS, and while the rendering resolution is lower on GOG, this version offers some options which aren't available in the classic Rebirth mod, like MSAA and full-screen integer scaling. Also, it's possible to convert the GOG version to use the classic Rebirth or seamless HD mods, but it requires acquiring the files from the 96 Japanese PC version. Now let's talk about the differences between the PC versions and the PlayStation original. The PC versions all have fully uncensored cutscenes, while the PlayStation requires the true director's cut ROM hack, as I discussed before. But you can't get the original content from the director's cut on PC, only the new camera angles if you use the seamless HD mod, and the unlockable costumes are different from the PlayStation and Saturn versions. The PC version is also one of the only versions that allows the player to skip the door transitions. Aside from that, there are some minor visual differences between the PC and PlayStation versions. For example, during this intro cutscene, on PC there's a bug with Wesker's shadow that's present in all PC variations but not on Duckstation. The blood puddles are lighter and more transparent than on Duckstation. And some particle effects, like the glass shards from this window, are fully opaque on PC while they're transparent on Duckstation. And one last thing, the audio quality on PC is quite lower than on Duckstation. Take a listen. You can improve this using the high-quality music pack from the classic Rebirth mod, but the general sound effects are still going to sound worse than on Duckstation. Finally, there's one more version to talk about, which is the Nintendo DS version running on the MelonDS emulator. This version released in 2006 and was called Resident Evil Deadly Silence, and it featured a lot of changes and new content compared to the original. It included a Rebirth mode, which featured more enemies, reshuffled items, and new puzzles which made use of the touchscreen on the DS. It also featured a new combat system that was used on knife battle events triggered when entering certain rooms. The character models were also remade from scratch and used new animations. Jill Valentine in particular received a couple of upgrades. Speaking of which, the unlockable costumes are once again different from previous versions, but not everything is upgraded. The FMV cutscenes, which are censored in this version, have a lower color depth than previous versions, which causes noticeable color banding, although they still play at 15 FPS. The pre-rendered background textures are much more saturated than previous versions, but seem to be about the same resolution. And the audio quality, while better than the PC and Saturn versions, still doesn't match the PlayStation version. Also, this version allows the player to skip the door transitions like the PC versions. Now, what about the emulation on MelonDS? As you've been seeing in the footage, the emulator allows you to increase the rendering resolution, although there seems to be some artifacting on character models that are distant from the camera. Aside from that, the emulator seems to run the game perfectly fine, with no noticeable visual or audio glitches, especially when playing at the native resolution. Also, the emulator supports all of the DS features such as the microphone, the touchscreen which you can emulate with the mouse cursor, and so on. It also lets you choose various screen configurations, but at the moment it doesn't let you separate the screens to different windows. So, after trying all of these different versions, which one is the best? I personally prefer the PlayStation True Director's Cut version on Duckstation. I think it offers the best combination of content and audio and visual quality. In addition to that, Duckstation has the largest amount of customization available for visual presentation, whether you prefer high resolution or retro graphics. The PC version is a great option too, particularly with the seamless HD mod, but it is inferior in terms of content and audio quality, not to mention a few graphical effects. But if your PC is very low end, the GOG version is probably the best option for you. As for the other versions, Deadly Silence is an interesting option due to all of the content differences, but I don't see a reason to play the Saturn version unless you are very interested in the differences in graphical fidelity or the battle mode. So, there it is. I hope you enjoyed the video. Were you surprised by some of the differences between the versions? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to get in touch with me, follow me on X. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil.